Dark was the night, cold was the ground. Whoever knew silence could say so much. As they careened through the vacuum of space, it was the silence that gave the most pause. Captain Easton James sat strapped to his seat, staring out the window into the endless void, hoping to hear a creak of the floorboards, a rattle in the hull, the sigh of a passenger. Anything recognizable, anything to remind him of home. Instead, he was left to linger in the silence, a most unwelcome host. He had left Earth 3 days ago, still unclear on why. Since then, he had gone through every conceivable reason and decided it could not be for anything good. James wondered if he was going to his execution. It made enough sense. Humanity had to appease the Council, and somebody had to answer for the crimes committed on the Argon. He debated how he would handle his sentence. Would he be the strong soldier, nobly accepting his fate? Or would he quiver with fear? Was he actually the man he always figured? James had to keep himself occupied if he was going to survive his travels with his sanity intact.
Why put windows on a spaceship?
He thought.
Do they want me to lose my mind?
He was. 3 days of space travel, James welcomed the thought of insanity at this point. He had flown in space before, but traveling to the Martian colonies was a much easier trip. A day at most, and generally accompanied by pleasant people. His 2-person entourage seemed about as pleased by their presence as James was. They picked him up yesterday, at the Nexus spaceport in the Gamsec-Rom system, and had spoken 1 sentence to him in the time since. Interstellar travel wasn't so bad. The ships are large and spherical. They spin so as to simulate gravity. You can, hypothetically in this case, walk around. There were recreation areas, social, passenger and more. But the small transport shuttles that move you from spaceports to the ground make for much harsher conditions. Cramped and claustrophobic and completely devoid of gravity, James's seatbelt was the only thing keeping him in place. The last time he was in a shuttle like this, he was heading into battle against an alien force. There was a palpable sense of fear then, but also excitement. Testosterone filled the air, seeping into your pores and filling you with the kind of esprit de corps only a good fight can. Things seemed so much simpler back then. Not 2 years passed, and James's world had been completely flipped upside down. Who would have thought that the bureaucracy, corruption and warring of 22nd century Earth would seem so mundane by comparison? A galactic civilization that spans the stars, encompassing dozens of species, thousands of planets and billions of individuals. And James had been summoned to their capital. He recalled the feeling. Sitting in his office, sifting through message after message, when an urgent order came through from Lieutenant Colonel David Hampton.
Captain James, you are to report to the office of High Counselor Vikchurk Amsk on Jadar on 164, 1550 at 1600 hours. Attached you will find your travel itinerary and protocol for addressing the High Counselor. Safe travels, Marine. Semper Fi.
The ceiling caved in and fell into James's lap, pinning him in place. Only a handful of humans have left the Sol system, and all of them high-ranking officials of the URE government. What business does someone like James have with a High Counselor? It took him a half-hour to move, and another 20 minutes to convert the galactic calendar to Earth's. He stared at his itinerary until his eyes ached from discomfort. From Earth he would be travelling to the Solus Rune spaceport, then onto Azura Knot, then Nexus, and finally, the capital planet of Jadar. 3 days, 11,000 light-years, and nothing but silence for company. James had only seen aliens once before, on board the Alliance Auxiliary Navy ship Argon. He didn't get a good look. He remembered them being more intimidating than this. Could he trust that memory? This wouldn't be the first time his mind had warped and changed reality. Memory is odd that way. It distorts the objective, projecting past experience onto the present to form a version of reality that conforms to our ideal. He remembered them attacking. Or were they defending? It all happened so fast. When he left Earth, James was cautioned not to look at anyone too long. In the spaceports, find a secluded corner and don't come out of it. And speak to as little people as possible. However, James found that other species were more interested in him than he was in them. He drew long, obvious stares everywhere he walked. Children would come up and probe him with questions, though when James tried to answer, they gave him confused, unknowing looks. He was relieved when he got to the Nexus spaceport and found 2 Alliance soldiers waiting to escort him the rest of the way to Jeddah. They kept everyone else at bay. James imagined people looked at him and suspected him a prisoner of the Alliance, taken to Jeddah to answer for humanity's crimes. James himself wondered this. Ultimately, he did not mind. The entourage meant he did not have to worry about aliens. He finally had peace and quiet. But now that quiet was driving him insane. He glanced around the shuttle. It was only the 3 of them. James recognized their species. He could not tell their gender or discern anything about them, but he knew which one he preferred. The Inaran, relatively human-like in appearance. Tall, slender, with light blue skin. It looked to have an almost rubber-like texture to it. The hair was thick, black, tied up smartly on top of the head. A sharp face betrayed the human resemblance, with a narrow jaw and pointed chin, thin lips and a flat nose. Bioluminescent freckles covered the body, glowing a soft shade of teal. The eyes were the most alien aspect of the Inarans. The sclera was black, with purple hues shining. The iris appeared to shimmer, moving subtly. As it danced, it changed colours, slowly emerging as a green. Overall, the alien wasn't hard to look at. James hoped it was a female. He spied the chest to confirm. The Inaran body seemed to resemble the human in this regard too. Down below, she had a narrow waist that gave way to wide hips and long legs. James looked too long, and the Inaran caught his gaze. He let the corner of his mouth rise ever so slightly. She quickly looked him up and down and gave him a look that was not displeased. She then turned to look out the window at the vast emptiness of the cold void. The other was far less appealing. An eelherk, he knew. Still tall, this alien had an elongated head, no hair. There were 2 piercing eyes. They sat wider, closer to the side of the head than the front. It couldn't be seen now, but James knew the eelherk had a 3rd eye on the back of the head. There was no nose and the mouth was smaller, tighter, and circular. The skin had a reflective quality to it, almost glass-like. It caught the light in odd ways, refracting light that often obstructed James's view. The creature had 4 arms, 2 that looked similar to humans, but 2 other smaller arms extended from slightly lower on the torso. These arms were shorter, weaker. They appeared to be permanently bent at a 45-degree angle, resting high on the chest, close to the neck. James decided this was a male, if for no reason other than the look on his face. While the creature was alien, that look was far too familiar. He wondered if these aliens knew anyone who served on the Argon. Served, he thought. It was a civilian ship. Nobody served on it. He continued to look out the window, into his future. The darkness grew darker. Blackness leaked into the cabin through the seals on the windows. It swirled around him, a terrifying, beautiful display of misery and despair. The rest of the cabin was gone. James was flying. Or was he falling? He looked around but saw nothing. In the distance, he heard a long, uninterrupted chime. It was faint, but it was something. James wanted to move towards it, but it was coming from all directions. He was unsure if was hearing a chime or nothing at all. The silence had taken him. He bounced in his chair, forcefully, bringing him back to the ship. As he looked around the cabin, he saw lights flashing. They were entering Jadar's atmosphere. He felt it in his legs first, the invisible pull of gravity. Once through, all the weight in his body came back. It is a feeling he had never gotten used to. James leaned back in his chair, his stomach inching up his throat. He gripped the armrests tightly. His knuckles whitened, his muscles tightened, and his teeth grinded. He felt sick. But then his ears popped, and just like that, all was well. He heard it. The engine humming, the wind thumping the side of the shuttle. James had spent the last 3 days worrying about the nature of his summons, but all his doubt and insecurity had been left in the void of space, noise to fill the silence. The entry had upset his stitches. The surgery was quick and easy. The device had been donated by the Alliance. It had a long, complicated name, full of numbers, letters, dots and dashes. But James knew all he needed to know about it. It allowed him to talk to aliens. He had been outfitted with it shortly before he left Earth. Whenever an alien would talk to him at a spaceport, James felt the dim vibration of the device. It wasn't painful or intrusive, but there certainly was a feel to it, like the feeling of one's tongue moving in their mouth as they talk. He scratched at it, but soon became distracted by the sight of the capital city. James had spent time learning as much as he could about the species of the Milky Way. He had seen pictures of their cities, Feliluna with its massive inverted city that hangs over a cave like some futuristic stalactites, Zila with its second city sat atop the first, but none compared to the simple awe that was inspired by Jadar. Sat alone atop a massive cliff-top high in the mountains, the city stood proud over the vast jungles that loomed thousands of feet below. Further back on the cliff-top rested a calm and serene lake. From it, a river flowed across the cliff until it spilled over the edge, cascading into a mist that blended with the sky. The city itself was a simple thing. 2 massive roads ran parallel to the river on either side, with ornate bridges connecting them at even intervals. From these roads, several smaller backstreets split off and wove a path through the city's humbler sections. Starting at the base of the cliff-top, the buildings were short and stout, no more than 5 stories, all built of a metallic material, white as quartz, fixed with yellow-gold ornaments that gave the city a regal feeling. Continue down toward the edge, however, and the buildings got taller and taller still, until they were eclipsed by Jadar's crown jewel, the Conclave. An arrowhead of a building, the Conclave jetted up more than 200 stories in a sleek and slender design that ended in a sharp point, piercing the heavens themselves. The evening sun refracted off the shard and illuminated the whole city. This was the seat of power in the Milky Way, home to the Ambassadors Board and all the major syndicate space agencies. Most importantly, it was home of the Supreme High Council. James tried not to look impressed. He hadn't presumed to be an honored guest, and since entering the atmosphere, his host kept glancing toward him. James assumed they hoped to see his reaction to the might and sophistication of their civilization. The moment when he realized he was but an ant, picking a fight with a boot. He would not give them that satisfaction. Still, one glance at their capital was all that was needed to know who would prevail if it came to war. The shuttle slowed abruptly, jerking James in his seat. They circled high on the Conclave, approaching a landing bay cantilevering out. There was no way to know how high they were, but it was plain to see they were much closer to the top of the building than the bottom. James felt his stomach drop. He had spent the trip preparing for the judgment he was to receive, but sitting here, at the seat of galactic power, paraded through by armed escorts like some lowly criminal, James felt like he was 7 years old, sitting outside the school principal's office, waiting for chastisement. The landing bay was large. A waist-high glass pane ran around the edge, serving as a safety railing. What looked like cherry trees were planted along the perimeter. 2 long, shallow pools ran along the centre, forming a de facto walkway. There, a host stood. The shuttle touched down gently. The engine thrummed as it turned off. James's Eelherk escort elbowed him roughly and nodded toward the door. He stood up smartly and exited the shuttle. He wore his dress uniform, the thick black wool jacket fastened up to his neck that was customary of an officer of the United Republic of Earth. The gold buttons that held the jacket were embossed with a depiction of Earth, each one showing a different hemisphere. His white pleated pants were wrinkled from the travel, but nonetheless remained of serviceable wear. His service cover was fixed with sprawling gold leaflets encircling a golden star in the centre. The star represented nothing. James imagined they just grew tired of the Earth motif. The uniform felt wrong. It resembled his old Marine Corps uniform well enough, but whereas that uniform had been forged by more than 300 years of history and tradition, this new uniform was hastily thrown together to lend the newly formed URE a better sense of legitimacy. Out here, on an unknown world, summoned for an unknown reason, clad in an unknown uniform, James was well and truly alone. Which made it all the more important he refused to be intimidated. If this was to be his execution, James would face it with dignity. He'd show these aliens the merit of human bravery. He and his escorts were greeted by a party of 7, some Inaran, some Eelherk, some other species. James had studied so much it was all blurring together. Was the big one a Voltrum? Or maybe a Throlin? He definitely remembered that word. Thankfully, they were led by an Inaran. She stepped forward, with her copper skin and dark hair tied up in a complex braid that wrapped and weaved around her head. Her eyes were a deep blue with a hint of teal threatening from the centre. She wore a light porcelain-coloured dress that was fastened to a silver collar she wore around her neck. The dress would have been loose-fitting if not for the thin silver tinsel fastened about her waist. The fabric ran down her right arm, tight to the wrist, but her left side was exposed, her arm naked from the shoulder to the fingers. A silver metallic piece was woven into the fabric at the sternum. It encircled her exposed left breast, creeping inward to preserve her modesty. James clenched his jaw as she approached.
"Good day, Mr. James,"
she said.
"My name is Elincia Adnala, assistant to High Counselor Amsk. I understand you have an appointment with the High Counselor." Her lips didn't match what she was saying. James wasn't looking forward to getting used to this. There was so much he wanted to say, but he knew this wasn't the time or place. A simple,
"Yes, ma'am,"
would have to suffice. Elincia smiled.
"A man of few words? I think you will get along fine with our High Counselor."
"He seems to keep good company, at least."
James let the right corner of his mouth rise slightly. Elincia's eyes narrowed. She studied him head to toe, then met his eyes. She curled her mouth in an approving smile.
"If you would follow me, I'll show you to the High Counselor's office."
She pivoted on her heels and strode off. James followed behind her, his escort keeping a pace with him. Elincia stopped quickly and addressed them.
"The High Counselor sent only for Captain James. Until such time as you are needed, you are welcome to remain here."
She gave them a disapproving look.
"Or leave, it really doesn't matter."
She resumed her march, her own host parting as she walked. James didn't linger. though he did wish to see the look on his Ilherk escort's face. Two massive glass doors slid open as they approached. The interior of the conclave stood in stark contrast to the exterior, while from the outside the building appeared sleek and modern and simple. The inside was medieval, with rib-vaulted ceilings 40 feet high, cold granite floors and Baroque art, busts and statues and historic relics dotting the walls, chandeliers hanging smartly from the high arches. There was a desk there, simple, minimal.
I trust you travelled well then?
Elincia asked. She walked past the desk and continued down the hall. James had hardly noticed her question. His eyes jetted back and forth, up and down, taking in the splendour. She glanced over her shoulder toward him, to probe him.
Oh, yes, ma'am. Travel was just fine.
I assure you there is no need for such formalities around me, Captain. I am only an assistant.
I don't think I believe that,
he said playfully. There was a confidence to her. She might not have been a High Counselor, but if Elincia Adnala was a mere assistant, these aliens held the position in higher regard than humans. She smiled, but said nothing. As they continued down the hall, the wall on their left turned to glass. Through it, James saw the massive atrium that descended hundreds of stories to the bottom of the conclave. Sunlight shimmered through the glass point of the building and lit the whole interior. Drones flew about, delivering messages and packages. Elevators zipped up and down, carrying dozens of passengers. James saw politicians and diplomats of a dozen different species milling about like worker ants. Far off, on a floor, several stories down, he saw a smartly dressed man. Elincia stopped and turned to James.
This is High Counselor Amsk's office, Captain James. You may go in and wait for our High Counselor. He will not be long.
I appreciate the escort, Ms. Adnala.
James's voice was deep and full of bass. She smiled politely.
Yes. Well, best go in. It wouldn't be polite to keep your superior waiting.
Elincia began to walk away. James blinked and turned hurriedly toward her.
I thought you said the counselor wasn't in there.
The High Counselor is not.
She spoke over her shoulder.
But you have proven to be quite in demand, it would seem.
As Elincia walked away, the fear returned to James. The anxiety he felt when the shuttle touched down, that had momentarily abandoned him, came rushing back stronger than before. He reached out his hand, shaking, and stared at it, breathing deeply until he was steady. This is justice, he told himself. He entered. The office was large, though not as grand as he had expected. A single step raised the back half where the desk sat. An imposing, thick workstation centered on the large window that occupied the entire back wall. Natural sunlight warmed the room. The office was decorated with artifacts. A golden scepter inscribed with alien language hung centered above the couch on the left-hand side of the room. Opposite it was a bar, stocked with bottles filled with dancing liquids. The high vaulted ceiling was outmatched by the ornate chandelier that floated centered above the room, watching, listening. But for all that, it was the figure standing tall that grabbed James's attention. The bright sunlight shining through the windows obscured his vision. He squinted his eyes to better see. The silhouette did not look Inaran or Ilhyuk. It was more familiar than that. It was distinctly human. James moved closer. It was a man. He could tell from the hair. Short, brown, shaved on the sides. On his torso he wore a long-sleeved black jacket that looked to be made of wool. A leather belt fastened tight around his waist. White gloves wrapped hands that draped to either side. Clean, pressed white trousers fell to his ankles where freshly polished corframs stood. James recognized the uniform. The Marine turned. James knew the face. Experienced, but not old. Intimidating, but not cruel. James wiped the look from his face. He pressed his heels together with his toes pointed out, straightened his back and raised his chin high. He locked his arms and curled his fingers. He tightened every muscle in his body and cleared his throat.
Colonel Hampton,
he greeted. Joy and relief were plain to see in his face as he saw James.
Jim!
He made a beeline for James, arm outstretched. He took his hand and shook it aggressively.
My God, you have no idea how good it is to see another human.
James had some idea. James blinked, unaware what to say.
Colonel, I didn't know you'd be here.
Had no intention to be.
The colonel responded curtly.
But, as you know, when the counselor calls, you answer.
The High Counselor, Elincia's words rang in his head. James hesitated a moment.
Colonel, do you...
I don't know why you're here, Jim.
The colonel finished.
I doubt it's a court-martial, if that's what you're afraid of.
James was relieved to hear that.
The counselor asked me for recommendations on Marines for, something.
And you gave him my name, sir?
The colonel laughed through his nose.
Hell no. But he shot down every name I gave him. Didn't even bother with the dossiers on some of them. Whatever it is. He wanted you.
James's relief was short-lived.
Have you met the High Counselor yet, sir?
No, I haven't had that honor yet.
The colonel said casually.
But I've seen this song and dance before. He's trying to intimidate us. My advice?
He leaned in.
Don't give him the satisfaction.
James could not disagree. He too had witnessed similar displays of authority in his time. His mind was racing with possibilities, yet he found a calmness in the colonel that helped put him at ease. The men were interrupted by the office doors sliding open. They snapped, stood at attention.
Lieutenant Colonel Hampton, I'm so glad you could make it.
The voice came from behind them. As the figure moved up the step and in front of them, James met his eyes. Never look around at attention, he knew, but sheer curiosity got the better of him. Vesak Amsk had the look of a politician. Compared to the Eelherk on the shuttle, Amsk was tall, though no more than 6 feet. His hard skin was a pale grey blue, with crystalline plates on the forehead and shoulders. He had small penetrating eyes of amber and short hairs on his chin. He was garbed in a tunic that fell to the floor, a soft, light red material with golden trim. Like Elincia, Amsk's wardrobe was not solely fabric. Parts of his tunic were silver links, resembling chainmail. The placement of these sections seemed to be random. There were slits on either side, exposing orifices along the torso. These sphincter-like holes opened and closed in rhythm, like they were breathing. Amsk made his way to James.
Captain James, a true pleasure.
Amsk didn't speak vocally. The second set of arms, the smaller, weaker ones emerging from lower on the Eelherk torso, moved in a way that resembled human sign language. The translator assigned Amsk a royal voice. It was an odd sensation, watching this creature mime his words and having them translated in real time. This thing did not resemble any form of intelligent life. James knew he was standing in front of one of the most powerful figures in the galaxy, but it was difficult to convince himself of that. Amsk extended his right arm, the larger, more normal-looking one, hand open. The gesture confused James. He had studied Eelherk culture and customs during his travels. Eelherk greet each other by folding their arms behind their back and bending backward at the waist, slightly. It was supposed to be a disarming gesture, showing the lack of danger and willingness to comply. Why is he trying so hard to use human customs? Nonetheless, James played along. He was nervous, touching the Ilherk's hand. But he did not let this hesitation betray him. The Ilherk grasp was strong. The skin of the palm was not as rough as the rest of the exterior. But as the 3-finger wrapped around James's hand, he felt an odd discomfort.
"Oh, please, don't stand so rigid. Makes me nervous."
The two men widened their stance and crossed their arms behind their backs. Amsk gave them a queer look, then shrugged. He reset his focus on James.
"You were on the team that took down the Argon."
It wasn't a question. The statement took James by surprise. The callousness with which the High Counselor spoke showed no sympathy. James waited too long to respond. He knew. What he said was a dry and flat,
"I was, sir." 218 people died on that ship. Only you made it out alive. How'd you do that?
Amsk spoke quickly and quite matter-of-fact. He turned and walked towards his desk. Now looking at him from the back, James saw the third eye the Ilherk possess. Centered on the back on the elongated head, this eye was wider than the other two. It was a gross sight. These people are always watching, James thought. He felt anger growing. He had no wish to talk about the Argon, but he could not refuse the High Counselor. He sighed.
Our mission was twofold: eliminate the enemy and gather intelligence on their technology. I was tasked with scanning their engines and weapon systems. When the mission went sideways, I was ordered to get the intel back to Earth.
Amsk turned back to face the two men.
"Eliminate the enemy,"
Amsk quoted.
"Tell me, Captain, am I your enemy?"
He certainly presents like one, James said to himself. The gaudy office, the condescending tone, the clear display of power. Veserk Amsk checked all the boxes of an insecure political figure leveraging his authority to demand that which he cannot command. Respect. James suppressed the intrusive thought, said simply,
No, sir.
Amsk seemed amused at James's obvious frustration. He refocused the conversation, saying,
"And so, you left your men to die?"
James held Amsk's gaze, matching the fiery stare with his own.
I followed the orders I was given, sir.
James said, this time purposefully sounding aggressive. Amsk studied him, his eyes looking right through him.
"Apologies if I gave offense, Captain,"
Amsk said. He turned and walked around to the other side of his desk.
"But your background is precisely why I called you here."
He glanced at Colonel Hampton and back to James.
"I understand you two share a kinship?"
James looked at Hampton in his peripheral. It was the Colonel who answered.
No, sir, but we are very close.
The High Counselor studied them confusedly.
"Of course. It seems our people have a different understanding of the word."
Sir, I'd like to add that my recommendation of Captain James is based exclusively on his merits as a Marine.
Colonel Hampton interrupted. Amsk looked annoyed at the statement. The dramatically different facial features made it difficult to gauge his thoughts.
"Understood, Colonel,"
Amsk said dryly. He paused for a moment, then said,
"Gentlemen, I think we should get to the matter at hand."
Thank God, thought James.
"I need you to help me with something, Captain,"
Amsk said, this time sounding significantly less condescending.
And what might that be, sir?
Amsk looked around the room. He suddenly appeared nervous.
"What I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room. If word gets out, you'll both be executed for treason."
After spending the last 3 days coming to grips with his own execution, the High Counselor's threats fell slightly flat. The two men nodded.
5 days ago, High Counselor Calarel Tiriara was found dead in her chambers. We believe it was murder.
Amsk said matter of fact. James blinked. The name meant nothing to him, just another faceless, formless alien. The title, however, gave him pause. Syndicate Space was the largest sovereign state in the Milky Way, comprising nearly half the galaxy. It was governed by the Alliance, a complex political body full of bureaucrats and bootlickers. And at the top was the Supreme High Council, a panel of 4 individuals from the most dominant species. They set laws, declared wars, and controlled the greatest superpower in the history of sapient life. If one of them had been killed, it meant God could bleed. Hampton broke the silence.
How?
He asked.
A single gunshot wound to the back of the head. Small caliber, efficient. She was found in her apartments here in the Conclave.
Amsk explained.
Who else knows, sir?
James contributed.
Myself, the other High Counselors, and now you two.
And the crime scene?
James questioned.
How's that being handled?
Amsk canted his head.
It's being handled, Captain.
He made the last word a curse. It made no sense. Why involve humans at all? They were the scourge of the galaxy, confined to Earth by the Alliance until a decision could be made about their treason.
And you would like my help to solve the case, sir?
James asked, confused.
I am told you were a bit of a crime solver for your Earth military.
I was Marine CID for 6 years, sir.
James answered.
But that hardly qualifies me to take on a case like this.
Amsk waved his hand and turned.
Nonsense,
He declared.
Who better to investigate the crime than someone so unattached? Your objectivity cannot be questioned.
My qualifications can be.
James said abruptly.
I've never seen your galaxy, sir. I don't know your law codes. I don't know your customs. I appreciate your vote of confidence, but I can't help but feel like I'm out of my depth here.
James had never enjoyed the feeling of being played, and while he did not know much of the High Counselor, he carried himself like a man who knows more than he lets on.
Colonel,
Amsk turned to face Hampton.
are all your soldiers so stubborn?
I can't speak to the soldiers, sir, but Marines are hard-nosed sons of bitches, it's true.
Colonel Hampton replied, simply. Amsiske played at his lips with the small hands that had been used for talking. He let out loud exhale through the orifices on his torso.
Captain, you are my honored guest. I was given your name specifically from this man.
He pointed at Colonel Hampton.
There is no one I would trust more.
You don't strike me as the type of man who trusts anyone, James thought. James had no interest in playing in the aliens game, but he was also no fool. He had dealt with fragile men before.
And if I refuse, sir?
He questioned, in a polite if challenging tone. A genuine look of confusion dashed across the alien's face.
Refuse?
He chuckled.
Forgive me, but I am afraid I gave the impression this is a request.
Amsk locked his eyes with James. Wicked eyes they were. A piercing dark yellow dancing around a pupil so small it disappeared. The eyes betrayed no emotion. James swallowed hard. He would have to pick his next words carefully.
With respect, sir.
The words came out slowly, as if James was speaking them for the first time.
I am a Marine of the United Republic of Earth. I do not belong to the Alliance or...
You're also a wanted terrorist.
Amsk snapped. His tone was harsh, his pleasantries abandoned, his patience exhausted.
One word from me, and you will be taken, imprisoned, tried, and executed.
With each threat, he took a step closer. He was only an arm's reach away now.
And there is not one thing your human government would do to stop me.
Amsk gave a cursory glance at Colonel Hampton, who stood motionless beside James.
Presume to tell me the length of my reach again, Captain,
He leaned close.
and I will show you the extent of my grasp.
James had miscalculated. He had, in fact, never met a man like Veksurkamsk in his life. The rest was a blur. Words echoed around him, his vision tunneled. It wasn't until he snapped out of his trance he realized he was no longer in the High Counselor's office. He was now in a different room, a simpler one. This room had no windows. Odd shapes were built into and jutted out from the walls. James assumed this was meant to be furniture. Colonel Hampton had been prattling on about his dislike for the aliens and cursing their circumstance.
Sir,
James interrupted.
what the hell?
The colonel said nothing, but he gave James a sympathetic stare.
We can't do this.
James said, confusedly. The colonel exhaled and walked toward him.
Think we have to.
James felt anger building. He didn't trust the situation. He didn't trust that alien.
No, sir, I'm not lamenting the duty. I'm saying we can't do this. We don't have the resources. We don't even know what we're stepping into.
Yeah, you're probably right, Jim. But what else are we going to do, huh? We're here. We're all humanity's got.
James found the notion almost insultingly self-important.
Respectfully, sir, we're not advocating for shit. We're here because we're disposable.
The colonel reddened.
The URE is being held together with fucking tape, Jim. We need allies.
And you think he's won?
The colonel opened his mouth, closed it. He took a breath to calm himself.
No, I don't. But I know an empty threat when I hear one, and that wasn't it.
He stepped closer.
And he's right. If he calls for your head, there's nothing I can do.
James let out a breath. He felt deflated at the realization of his circumstance. The colonel spoke in a sympathetic tone.
So for now, we play the game.
He was right, James knew. For the first time, James set his mind to the task. He couldn't shake his initial reflex, though.
Okay, well, all my instincts are telling me that guy sounds guilty as hell.
Good. Prove it.
The colonel co-signed.
Either we solve the case for him and earn a favor, or we prove his guilt and we've got his balls in a vice. So to speak, of course.
James's mind began to come alive, racing with different leads and possibilities. His eyes darted from one side to the other. He looked up at the colonel.
What about you, sir? What are you gonna do?
The colonel chuckled.
Anything about this situation give you the impression I got a choice?
He let himself smile, trying to bring some measure of levity to the situation.
I'll stay here. Find out what I can.
The colonel looked at him differently now, worriedly. He wasn't speaking to him as a superior anymore, but as a friend.
But you be careful out there. Stealth's out the window. You're going to get recognized everywhere you go. So watch your back.
James struggled to know what to say. The colonel meant a lot to him. James saw something in him he had only seen a few times before. Genuine fear. It felt good to have someone worry for him. James was never good at this part, though. Tell him. Tell him what he means to you, he thought. Why, though? The colonel was a smart man, he already knew. This wasn't the time for sentiment. They were going into a viper's nest. Because you might not get the chance again. It wasn't a hard thing to say. So why did it feel so hard? James tried to bring the words to bear, but in the end, he couldn't. He brought his heels together, stiffened his posture, and said clearly,
Aye, sir.
The colonel accepted that in the spirit it was given. James exited the room. For the first time in days, he felt calm. He had his mission, and there would be no backup or support. In an odd way, James felt solace in this solitude. It made things clear, simple to understand. The first step was always the same: investigate the crime scene. James looked around to orient himself. At the end of the hall, some ways down, he could see the large glass doors he entered from the helipad. He paced the hall to the doors. There, Elenicia Adnala sat smartly at a desk. She looked at him kindly, signaling with her eyes that she was ready to receive his request.
Excuse me, ma'am. I need to see High Counselor Tiriara.
That amused Elincia. As she laughed, the hue emanating from her pupil shifted from a deep green to an inviting yellow.
I'm sure.
She spoke as though she was humouring him.
But that's not possible. The High Counselors are the busiest persons in the galaxy. You can't just visit them unannounced.
James was tired of hearing what he couldn't do. He could feel himself finding his confidence. He leaned on the desk.
This pertains to my meeting with High Counselor Amsk. She'll be expecting me.
Elincia looked pleased with him. She stood.
Of course, Captain. High Counselor Tiriara is in her quarters. I'll escort you there now.